No one ever sings in there. I don't know why they put them. No, I'm not in church. I've been to some actually that much. No one.
Oh, is that lovely? No.
It's that quarter.
It's almost Cromwell ghost.
It's like Sue Heaser into world history as me.
And I started laughing, and I thought, these are ones who explain why I'm laughing. And they sort of looked at
No, these are the blue papers to be, correct, yeah.
It got me thinking about when I was a student. I couldn't
Ready to go.
think about where I should.
Ladies and gentlemen, a number of guests duly introduced by fellows beg leave to attend your meeting. Is it your pleasure that I welcome them in your name? Thank you, fellows who are present. Thank you very much for that. Minutes, please.
Society of Antiquaries of London, ordinary meeting, Thursday, 17th of March 2022, in Burlington House and online. Professor Martin Millett, President, in the chair. The minutes of the previous ordinary meeting of Thursday, 10th of March 2022, were read and signed. The following communication was then laid before the Society: Cities, Towns and Villages Living in the Diverse Environments of the Indus Civilization, by Dr. Cameron Petrie. Thanks for return for this communication. The President announced that the next meeting would be the Out of London meeting in Exeter on Thursday, 24th of March 2022, then adjourned the meeting.
Is it your pleasure that I sign these minutes as a true and complete record? Thank you. Certificates.
Okay, I'll just remind fellows that I'm reading the shortened version of the blue papers, and the full version can be found on the website. Carol Bell, MA, PhD, has published on the economy and trade of the Eastern Mediterranean and has been the chair of the British School at Athens and vice president of the National Museum of Wales. Thomas Cromwell, BA, MA, a field archaeologist with Historic England, who has worked on excavations at Dover Castle, Windsor Castle and Eightfoot Hall. Derek Hurst, MA, an archaeologist specialising in the study of ceramics from later prehistory to post-medieval. Sean Thomas, BA, MA, PhD, an archaeologist specialising in the material culture of the southwest of England in the late Iron Age and Roman period.
Is it your pleasure that these certificates be suspended in the usual manner? Thank you very much indeed for that. We now come to the main business of today's meeting, which is to hear a paper, Glass Beads of the Anglo-Saxons, the Indigenous and the Exotic, an investigation into the beads and techniques of glass bead makers of the 5th to 7th centuries CE by Sue Heaser. Before I introduce the speaker, some practical housekeeping. There will be a question and answer session at the end, and we should be taking questions both in the room from the audience here and on Zoom and YouTube. If anyone would like to ask a question online, please type it in the chat function on Zoom or YouTube, and we shall ask as many as we can of these questions at the end of the lecture. Today's lecturer, Sue Heaser, is an author, illustrator and teacher with a lifelong interest in the jewellery arts. Her career began in archaeology, working as a finds assistant for the Museum of London and then as an illustrator for English Heritage, drawing ancient jewellery from all over Britain. She's accomplished in a wide variety of jewellery making techniques, including silversmithing, enamelling, and lampwork, as well as metal clay and polymer clay. Her project and technique books have been published all over the world and in many languages. Sue is currently researching the Anglo-Saxon beads of Britain and lectures on this subject at museums and universities. So, Sue, I'm happy now to hand over to you to speak to us about the glass beads of the Anglo-Saxons and your investigation into the beads and the techniques of the bead makers of the 5th to 7th centuries. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much for the welcome, and I'm delighted to be here at Exeter on this wonderful sunny afternoon to tell you about my research. So, glass beads of the Anglo-Saxons. Here we go. Right, now this is my project. It's a study of Anglo-Saxon glass beads to investigate their likely tools, materials, and techniques using practical experiments in hot glass. And as I've been reading my way through most of the literature probably by now, and looking and learning how to make glass beads using Anglo-Saxon tools, more about that soon, I've been noticing that how much this aspect of it has been neglected, the practical, in reports that have been going on beads, Anglo-Saxon beads in particular, but right across the periods. And the fact it's been neglected results in you get a very poor understanding of techniques. If you haven't actually tried how to make something, it's all very well inventing how you think something might have been made, but as I've discovered to my cost, you can have ideas, and then if you try them, you might find you're extremely wrong, and I've been finding that a lot. So you have poor understanding of techniques, you get errors in categorization as a result, you put the wrong beads into the wrong areas. You get perpetuated myths running down through reports for many years. Somebody will say this is how it's made, and people who have not tried it out will say, oh well, that's how it's been said it's been made, therefore that must be right. And then naturally that leads on to errors in analysis of beads. So these are the project stages that I set myself to do. First of all, study the finds, which involved running around pre-COVID to every museum I could find in the country that would let me in to have a look at most of their background beads and archaeological units. I was actually finding that I could see beads that hadn't yet been published from some very kind people letting me go in and have a look at them before. So I took thousands and thousands of photographs. I've got photography skills and I can use a macro. And if you start zooming in with the digital camera, you can see some pretty amazing things. I used to draw beads. Now I'm using a digital camera a lot to help me. So then the next thing to do, you want to identify the material. What is the glass that they were using for beads? There's been an awful lot of XRF and elemental analysis. But how does the glass handle the practical side of it? That's important too. Identifying the tools. It's always been said, no bead makers have been found or evidence of bead makers in Britain. Therefore, did it all the beads from Anglo-Saxon times, did they come from the continent? I've got some pretty good evidence that they didn't. So I needed to identify the tools. I then wanted to replicate the beads in hot glass. And here is a necklace that I made from a beautiful necklace from Westgarth in Bury St Edmunds. I've studied the beads in huge detail, and I've worked out slowly, it's taken a long time now, I've been doing this about 6 or 7 years, working out how each bead, each type of bead was made. And finally, analysing the results of what I had discovered, because this leads on to all sorts of other interesting aspects once you've gone this deep into the making of beads. And this little drawing, this little photograph at the bottom shows the millefiori, which is the exotic side of this tool. So, glassworking. First of all, let's try and divide them up, because glass beads often get just lumbered in with glass generally, and glass working. They are entirely different crafts. They could not be more different. If you could compare it with, say, wood carving, the wood carving of tiny netsuke, and the building of wooden tables or even boats, it's that different. You're using the same material, but the scale is hugely different, and virtually all the tools are entirely different. So other differences too, you've got glass vessels, almost always transparent, right through the periods. Nearly always. There are obviously examples where they're not. Tools for glass vessels, much larger, much more variety. And the furnaces are essential. You need a big furnace with a good glory hole and steady heat. And the craftsman, it's a lot easier to start blowing glass if you've got helpers. And this is another error that has been put onto bead making, that people have assumed that the bead makers needed helpers. You don't need a helper to make beads. So beads, why are they so different? Glass, mainly opaque. It's nearly always opaque glass. There are lovely examples of transparent beads, but they are the minority. Tools, small, very few. You can put them in a little satchel, tiny collection, because you're working, so very small. A small open flame source to make the type of beads we're talking about. There's an awful lot of clues in the beads that they are made using a very small flame source that you can move out of the heat easily, not a great big furnace. And a craftsman can easily enough work alone. I've got examples coming up that shows how this can be done. You can even stoke your furnace and then rush around and sit back on your little wooden stool and carry on making beads, because fluctuations in temperatures are not that critical when you're making beads. So, for people who are not familiar with the Anglo-Saxon cemeteries found in Britain, this is actually from Parquet in 2011, so this is a bit out of date. An awful lot more been found recently, particularly. There's a huge archive from these. You see every spot in this slide is of an Anglo-Saxon cemetery from 2011, and there are an awful lot of them. And there's a huge archive of beads that have been excavated and stored in British museums and stored workplaces. Many of them have not actually been fully studied, as I've been discovering. I've been going through, and some things, many are not published. So, and again, this gives a brief overview of Anglo-Saxon cemeteries. Up here we've got Burapton. It's how it's pronounced in Norfolk. Burgapton. It looks like quite a small cemetery. You can see the shapes of the graves and how they're orientated. Here we've got Holborough Hill in Kent. Incredibly scattered, aren't they? Perhaps they weren't very friendly with each other. They're very wide apart, aren't they? And Spong Hill, the famous, amazing Spong Hill, and the thousands, it was thousands, wasn't it, of graves there, and cremations as well. So some cemeteries have hundreds of burials, others only a few. Both cremations and inhumations in these Anglo-Saxon cemeteries, they encompass both types of burial. Not many grave goods with the cremations, and I have to say burnt beads are not very easy to study, so I'm afraid I haven't really gone too deeply into melted glass beads. So the types of beads. Beads from Anglo-Saxon cemeteries are from many different materials. First of all, we have the glass, which it makes up an awful lot of it. The percentage varies between the cemeteries. Decorated and both decorated and undecorated. Amber. In the period I'm talking about, the earlier times, the 5th to the 5th, 6th centuries, a lot of amber, which ends up looking very shabby indeed after being in the ground. I've been working in amber too to check out how that was made, but that's another story. Then you have rock crystal turning up. Lovely, beautiful. That's often combined with the lovely polychrome beads and with amber as well. You get some jet, this is rarer, and it seems to be that most of it seems to, well, particularly the jet itself rather than the lignites, were leftover heirlooms from Roman times. They seem to be mostly Roman. And amethyst, they come into the later graves, probably coming in from Afghanistan and India. And then also you've got coral, you've got fossil, you've got shell, animal teeth, silver and gold, huge range. But the glass and the amber is definitely the most common. So glass beads, though, give the most information of all, and especially polychrome or decorated beads. The glass, you can look at the glass, you can analyze it, the elemental analysis that's being so widely used now to show the origins of the types of elements that went into it, the silica, the lime, and all the stories about Wadi Natrun and the types of the way the glass was originally made, probably all made in the Middle Eastern area. And the oxides used for colouring, and that I've been dipping into more and more, trying out experiments mixing oxides into base glass to see exactly what would happen. Then you've got the designs, how the beads are decorated, the skill, the colours used, the colours chosen, the bead shapes. There's so much going on here. It's like looking at an old master painting where you're looking at the type of paint, the type of brush strokes. You can start seeing so much once you know what to look for. And then again, you move on to the arrangements, how beads were grouped into strings or groups, how they were worn. There's quite a lot of clues when beads are being carefully excavated. You can sometimes make up the order of how they would have been worn. And it shows individual preference. We're getting to the human element here. Mucking has got some wonderful beads where you've got a collection of dark green beads. They're all different colours, but they've got dark green as a predominant bead in one of the graves. So that lady, always ladies, was obviously that was her colour choice. We're getting into personal preference. How lovely in archaeology to do that. And of course, contemporary styles. There's a slight change of style as you go through these 200 years that I'm talking about. So here's a grave plan. This is Snape, grave 10. The Snape grave plans are fabulous. They've got some, for the bead point of view, they show very clearly where each bead was found. And I honed in on these early on. I've looked at all the Snape beads in great detail. Beads are normally only found in female graves and not in all female graves. And you do occasionally get single beads in male graves in Britain. They're usually considered to be sword beads. But a good site report with detailed maps can recreate the strings of beads in the order that they were worn. So here are some bead strings. Now, because of having been an archaeological illustrator and done a lot of illustration for my own books, I decided I would paint the necklaces as they would have looked, and in the arrangements where we do know the arrangements. These are very much in the minority. An awful lot you would have to be purely conjectural. But if you home in on the ones that you do have the order, and I don't just mean the way they've been strung in a museum by an enthusiastic curator at some point, I do mean the ones that have got decent grave plans. Then you can start building up how they did it. And as I've worked a lot in jewellery, also I know a lot about stringing beads, trust me, and how you would want them to hang well. So you tended to put your bigger beads down the bottom and have smaller infill beads up the side. But the Anglo-Saxons preferred to have their beads on the front of the chest. Very few beads are found behind the skeleton's neck, so we know that they were held in festoons a lot, or they could be in loops hanging down, possibly sewn to clothes. There's all sorts of possibilities. It's still very hard to actually find out because the fabric has pretty well all gone. So these are two. Now these are an interesting ones. This is Westgarth at Bury St Edmunds. This is Snape on the Suffolk coast. They're about 30 miles apart. And look how similar these two necklaces are. This has started making me very interested in, did we have somebody peddling their wares, moving around? The necklaces look as they've got the same stamp on them. They've got similar beads and even similar, the crystal beads, there's two, they look almost identical. And then we've got these twisted trail beads, red and green, the twisted trails cropping up. These seem to be, there's more about this coming, but these seem to be very much centered around the Cambridge area, where there's a huge number of those. I'm sure they must, it's pretty certain they were made in Britain. In between these two places, there is Ipswich, which was a port. And although the excavation at Hadley Road is a bit later, the beads are so different. They almost look foreign compared to the ones coming out of the little rural communities and more rural areas. So here's a painting I've done of the lady who was buried in Grave 10 in Snape with her festoon. She's got her two brooches, wishbone brooches here, holding her beads. And that's the one of the painting of the replica necklace that I showed in the previous slide. This is typical Anglo-Saxon burial, buried wearing her clothes, her brooches, her wrist clasps. They were very popular in East Anglia in particular, a typical burial. And most beads are found in graves dated between the 5th and the late 6th century. By the late 7th, the practice of using grave goods had largely died out. So that's why I homed in particularly on this area to study these beads. Now here's a slightly different one. This is from Holywell Row, which is just the edges of Suffolk and Cambridge. And slightly different, but this was excavated by Lethbridge long ago, 1930s, I think. And he did some sketches in his rather, he wasn't a great illustrator, but he could certainly show you what he was doing. And he wrote on the bottom, could be collected in the order in which they were found. So I went, yippee, and honed in on that. And so here we have it, as it would have gone into the grave. But of course, I have gleamed up all the glass beads and made them shiny. And this is how they are absolutely beautiful when you see what they would have looked like. Reconstructions make archaeology more approachable to the public. And I do think this is important. It's so lovely to reach out. When I show people who aren't archaeologists my paintings and say, this is what the Anglo-Saxons women were wearing, they're delighted. It's fascinating. It's a lovely thing to do. There's a modern practice in archaeology which separates the beads into individual finds for statistical analyses. And I find this in more recent excavations, I have been struggling to get an idea of what a necklace would have looked like, because beads are each bead is put in a separate bag and given a context number. And it makes it much, much harder for me. I'm sure it's fine for the analysis and keeping track of everything. But I do think that there is a place for trying to keep an overview of where a necklace, all the necklaces other beads are, to make things a little easier to get an overview. Some of the older excavations I've looked at, where you open a box, which probably would make people's hair stand on end today because it's probably a very bad practice, you can actually pull out the beads and arrange them to see how they might have looked. And then when everything's in separate bags, that's quite difficult. That's the way it is. So, but then there's another thing to say, and there's far more information in a whole necklace than in isolated single beads. If you take single beads and treat each bead as a find on its own, you're really losing a little bit of the story, or a lot of the story here. There's the combinations, the social significance, and there's a lot more work to do. So moving on to imported or made in Britain. This was fascinating me because I suppose a certain natural, I don't know, nationalistic feeling. I'm sure they must have made beads in Britain. And there's always been hints, a lot of people who said yes. With these, Berta Bruggeman in her study, she pointed out these are what she calls traffic light beads. And I find that a slightly unfortunate term because it covers beads that are red, green and yellow. And a bead maker doesn't necessarily, I mean, a fashion will follow a fashion in colour, but it's perfectly possible to make beads in any colour range once you've acquired the skills. So subdividing beads by colour is really getting a little too distant what is actually going on. So here we are. Were beads imported or made locally? Some types of Anglo-Saxon beads are only found in Britain. Now that makes it really pretty straightforward. That surely must be the source of them. And I've been looking very closely at these. I call them twisted cables. They can be called, Brugman called them traffic light twist, which is pretty, that's good too. But these are decorated twisted cables, and they do come in other colours. This is the main colour, but you can have black ones with yellow and green. You can have red ones with blue and white cables, and so on. So the traffic light could be dropped, I think. They appear very frequently in the period that we're talking about, and I think they are very likely by the same maker, even though there's a lot. I can make 30 beads in a day. Now, one person or a family group, maybe passing skills down, could have made, very small number of people could have made all the beads we've found so far. They also, these are very crudely made, really. They're not, I've just been up to an amazing site in Cameryngham in Lincolnshire that was excavated just last year as a community project. And they have got some beads, it's a bit later, they've got some beads with these twisted cables, but they are beautifully made, exquisitely, carefully made, with little fine, very fine stripes in it. That's a different hand. You can see it is. The people who made all these are almost one or two, maybe, possibly even one. So there we have some from Spon Hill, Morningthorpe, Barrington in Cambridgeshire. And here I've started a map. The black spots are where I haven't actually seen them myself, because I find traffic light beads are sometimes not the right ones. So I reject them. So the bigger beads, the bigger blobs indicate more than 4, and the little ones are 4 or less. I think that's 5 was my cut-off point. This is work in progress. I want to keep adding, and I'm on the track. I have also been looking at Europe, mainland Europe, and I have as yet, I've actually got in touch with the occasional curator of a museum, because I've heard some word whisper that they've got a traffic light bead. Nothing. So far, nothing. So even if I do end up finding a few, they will be exports, I'm pretty sure. So a bead maker who can make twisted cables could also make many of the other beads found from that time. Many of the beads here that in this slide would have been made in Britain, not imported from the continent. If you can do those twisted cables, and they're not terribly difficult, bead making itself is quite difficult, but once you could actually do some basic bead making and learn to decorate, you could do the twisted cable beads quite simply. I've been demonstrating them here this afternoon. Waves and spots, you could do those. Melon beads, you just need to make a bead and stab a knife into the side, no problem. Stripes, you pull thin stringers of glass. I shall be showing that later on in this. And of course, monochrome and random, absolutely no problem. So they're not that difficult to make. So bead signatures, many variables in Lampwork beads, Lampwork being the small source. You've got a heat source, the tools used, the type of glass. Glass can vary how much it's got of the different oxides in it to a certain extent, and how stiff or how soft and malleable it is, the hand of the maker. As in the case of paintings by old masters, individual bead makers can be identified from their beads. I didn't look for this, I slowly became aware of it. For example, here we have a bead from Ipswich and a bead from Westgarth. A blue trail crossing with red dots. Same type of bead aimed at. Here we've got the zigzags. Can you see that zigzag? Now that requires considerable control. I have great difficulty doing that. I'm not good enough yet for that one. there is a wavy trail. I should have had a bit more shot of that. That's easier. You can do that. Across here, the zigzag again. It's very likely that that was the same bead maker. What else have we got? This is another very definitely a British bead. That's Cambridge, and that's Holywell Row, but there are others further north in Barapton. They've got one of these too. They're relatively rare, but this is somebody who's got onto a good thing, found out how to make this, and they're delightful. They would have been transparent glass, so you could see through all the yellows. And this is a lovely story. This is where a bead maker used incompatible glass. This would have been beads like the ones up here. They turn up quite a lot over East Anglia, and all the blue has fallen out. And that was because the poor bead maker got some blue glass that had a different melting point. It's called also a coefficient of expansion will affect it. And so when they carefully made their beads, and probably either in the ground, it's very hard to know, but once it was buried, it could have been, or it could have been in where, as the they cooled differently, these two different colors, and so out pinged all the blue. And there's been a study by James Peake on the Eriswell beads, where fortunately, great good fortune, they analysed the Morningthorpe and Barapton beads and some from Eriswell, and they looked to be exactly the same glass. So that was a lovely, lovely find, that was. So the Indigenous bead maker, I'm now making a good case that we've got a British bead maker at this time. Could have worked alone, as I said, or in a small family group, could have been an itinerant artisan or family group moved around the country. What would they have needed? There's been some work, a lot of work by Thomas Rhizome working in Reba, slightly later, but Thomas has proved that just a patch of a hearth could have been a little volcano furnace like this. Now, this sort of furnace would be ideal for making these delicately decorated beads with very fine threads. A big furnace with a glory hole, it would be almost impossible to do a lot of these beads that I'm talking about. Now, this is out of Wikipedia. This is glass rods from the 16th and 14th century, the Common Era, just to show how long we've had glass rods. I just thought I'd put that in. They may well have used that, or as I'm going to explain, probably used, well have used tessera. These are the tools I have been using. I've restricted myself to tools that were available in those days. I had a mandrel made by a local blacksmith. This is what you make your beads on. You wind glass around it if you're doing round beads. It's tipped with some clay slip. You need a pair of tweezers and a pointy tool of some sort to draw feathering across beads, make not drawn beads, but the lined beads. A nice knife. I actually got a replica knife and stuck a bit of a wooden log on it. And here some tongs that I actually made myself. Now some of these wouldn't turn up in excavation because the wood wouldn't survive. But we know they had all that sort of thing available, quite tiny. Heat source. This is Thomas Rhizome's, my drawing of his experimental furnace. As I've been saying, most likely these beads, most of them were made, the Indigenous beads were made using lampwork, tiny heat source. Contemporary bead making furnace from Turkey. This is a glory hole for making a furnace with a glory hole, where you would reach in and you would have crucibles inside or possibly bigger tanks of molten glass. Now that is not what we're talking about by these particular beads. And this is my modern blowtorch. It hasn't got anything very fancy. It's really my equivalent of that, because I didn't really want to go and sit in the garden over a little pile of mud, because I thought it would slow me down rather too much. But Thomas has done it. He's made beads using his volcano furnace, and that's my project for next summer. I think I must get to grips with it. It's the modern equivalent. But modern bead makers will use much more sophisticated equipment. They have oxygen and gas and so on, and you can turn it down. My blowtorch, you can't really turn it up. It's one heat and that's it. So you have to adapt. Now, glass. Beads need very tiny quantities of glass. You need 50 grams of glass will make a necklace 45 centimeters long, depending on the size. Big chunky beads, you need more. But small beads, I've made them and weighed them. You don't need much glass. So where did they get their glass? Modern glass bead makers use these soda lime, the same type of glass, soft glass rods. And I'm suggesting very much so, just like they've been suggesting at Reba, the Anglo-Saxons probably used coloured glass tessera made for the mosaics in Roman and Byzantine times. And Reba has got barrowloads of tessera around the bead making workshops. So it seems highly likely. And I've been on a trail of finding, I found a lot of these coloured glass tessera in Britain. London has got a lot. The Museum of London, I went and examined, they had a lot of tessera have been coming out, glass. I'm not talking about stone tessera from the pavements on the floor. These would have been for wall mosaics. And they are in all the right colours for the beads. So here we are, same opaque colours as beads, only a small number are found in Britain, but were Roman wall mosaics robbed by Anglo-Saxons to make beads? It's feasible, certainly feasible, although no Roman wall mosaics have ever been found so far in Britain. Or did they import in quantities of the tessera from the Mediterranean? Because a lot of these tessera have got no mortar on them. So were they being imported? These are beads from Burupton in Norfolk, from Norwich Castle Museum, and you can see the colours. They are the same glass. And if you compare the elemental analysis for beads and for tessera, they're all coming out very much the same. And this is my photograph from Ravenna, same colours. So there's my tools. I've already talked about those. You need a mandrel, you need a pointed awl and some tweezers, the knife, and the tongs. And I did put in shears because glass blowers use shears, but in the end I've never used them. So you don't even need any shears. And here is my drawing of what a glass bead maker, how he made he or she, we don't know. Women could have made beads. You don't have to be strong to make beads. You're working so tiny and delicate. So here is a little volcano kiln. He's got his tools over there, his mandrels. And here we have some baskets with tessera and spare mandrels there. So bead making evidence in Britain. There's none for this period as I've found so far, despite thousands and thousands of beads. But there's a very good reason for that. An itinerant bead maker with no workshop would leave very little evidence. A small furnace would look like a half. The top would soon disappear, it would weather away, and it would just look like a half, like someone once said they found it by stove. Tools are small, and they're also used for other crafts. So how would you ever know that you actually found bead makers? The waist is minute. It's really tiny. Here's a photograph of my waist. Just a handful after hundreds of beads, and you can reuse it all. The original recyclers are here. They really are, aren't they? Constantly recycle. You know, if beads break, you can throw them back into the pot, divide up, and melt them down, and off you go. So here is some examples of beads that, as far as all my research over these last few years has been showing you, they are not found elsewhere. We've got these lovely overlying waves with spots, beautiful control there. You could never make that using a furnace to get those dots like that. Spotty beads, this is from Hadley Road, but they're cropping up all over the place. Not many. This is Swallow Cliff Down with a beautiful annular twist. These are a bit later. This is, I feel this is almost a development from the good old twisted trails from the earlier graves. Somebody got that down to an absolute fine art, and I think they are so hard to make. I've managed to achieve a decent one yet, and I think that must have been one person. And I've looked at a lot of these now, and I think they're the same bead maker. There's the little dumbbell one that I mentioned earlier, and here these are the ones from Cammeringham with these beautiful. You can make a twist with an S twist, like in spinning, an S twist in the glass or a Z twist, and you put the two together and you get these really delicate chevrons. This one's deteriorated too much, but that's blue and white on white. Absolutely beautiful. And there's a big barrel bead as well, showing huge control that, as far as I can tell, is unique in English graves. And these are the I call these the random decorated. They come a lot out of Norfolk. Berta Brugman pointed those out, but I have seen one or two on the continent of these. They're the only ones that I've actually seen elsewhere. And they could be the same hand on the continent. It's very hard to do random identically to someone else. It's even harder than to do control. And these are the donut beads, which seem to only crop up. These two are later. Here we are, sort of certainly getting into the 7th century. And these are often strung on copper or silver rings to make festoons. And they are pierced, and that's another story. So let's have a look at the bead making techniques of the Anglo-Saxons, as far as I've made it out. Now, here's me in my studio, and this is the size of my table, tiny. There's the blowtorch. Here's a glass rod. I'm using a glass rod. There's a mandrel, and here's sort of just your tools are around. And here are all the replica beads that I have made. And I do think they give an idea of what the beads would have looked like before they deteriorated. And it's the most difficult craft I've ever tried. It's I've done a lot of crafts over the years, including enameling and silversmithing and filigree. And this one, the learning curve was steep, explosive, and yes, disastrous at times. But it's been fascinating. I've also been fortunate enough, and I'm very grateful to Mola, who have allowed me to have some real Roman glass, because I decided it was vital that I should check that all my experiments using modern lampworking glass, it behaved in a similar way in the flame. Otherwise, you've lost everything, haven't you? I mean, if it's much stiffer or whatever. And I've already made a couple of beads, and here they are. And I'm happy to report they behave almost identically to the modern soda lime glass. So that means that all my struggles with glass over the last few years, I am replicating how the Anglo-Saxons would have worked, which is very comforting. So that's been very similar in the flame. I've got a lot more work to do on this Anglo-Saxon, on this Roman glass. So this is the process. Here's an example of making a bead with a tessera. You preheat the glass on a knife, holding it over your volcano furnace. You get your mandrel red hot, and you attach the pontil to the glass. You attach the pontil to the glass when it's hot, it'll stick. You then melt it. It's a bit like toasting fork with cheese on the end. You get it melted. You then bring in your mandrel and you wind it. I'm going to show a little short clip of video to show this happening with a glass rod. You then rotate in the flame, and a bead will then become a perfect sphere. If you want to shape it, you can use tongs, or you can press it against a flat surface, which is called marbling. But if you decorate a bead, you do not need a marber. So that's another erroneous point. They often say marbered in reports when they mean that the decoration is flush with the bead surface, but you just hold it in the flame and it'll sink in. So the term there is wrong. Marbling is to shape the bead. And this is using a glass rod where you just melt the tip and turn it onto the mandrel. So when you decorate polychrome beads, you need thin threads of glass, and they're called stringers, and it's like making a piece of spaghetti. So you melt your tessera, or you melt the tip of a glass rod, you grab it with the tweezers, and you pull, and it'll pull the glass out, and the glass will stiffen as you pull into a nice straight stick. And this is about the thickness. This is about 2 or 3 millimeters thick, and that's what you use to decorate. So using stringers, you make a bead, and then holding it as cool in the cool part of the flame, so fairly high up above, you then wind round, and then you heat it, and your wave will just sink beautifully into your bead. Spots are the same. You dab with the point of the little spaghetti stringer. So here's the video, which shows a brief glimpse of me. This was all done in lockdown, so I had to set everything up on the camera up on a tripod. So just do it yourself. I'll talk through it, but there are subtitles as well. So here we are. The tip of the glass rod is heated in the flame, and there's the mandrel coated with slip so that the bead will be easier to remove afterwards. And then you wind the glass onto the mandrel to make the bead. The negative shape of the mandrel is what forms the hole. And when you've got sufficient build-up of glass, you'll pull the glass away, put it away, and then you turn the mandrel in the flame, and slowly the actual properties of the glass will form it into a sphere. So moving quickly on to decorating. This is to making a cylinder bead. So tongs are actually more useful than a flat surface like a marble. You can just go around in little movements. Here's pulling a stringer, grabbing it with tweezers and pulling to make your piece of spaghetti, which is now stiff already as you lay it down. And here we are, using a stringer to make a wave pattern. You have to keep it quite cool, or else the stringer will just completely collapse. And then the bead is plunged. It's cooled in the flame to loses its colour and plunged into, I use vermiculite, or you can use warm sand or ash, they probably used in antiquity. You soak the bead on the mandrel to soften the clay slip, and a bit of effort, and there is the bead. Quite a fast process, really. And there is a collection of replica beads showing them how they would have looked. Right, twisted cables. These are the twisted trails. You put a blob of yellow on one pontil or you can use any old stick of iron or just use a rod of glass. Green on the other, you dab them together and then you twist and twist and twist in opposite directions, pulling them apart, a bit like making the stringer, but you end up with these, and that's what you use to decorate. And it takes a bit of practice, but once you've learned how to make a bead and not drop it all off blobs of glass everywhere, this is a nice, easy progression. So how would you do it? To make a long, thin cylinder, you wind a long way along your mandrel, heat it, and then you twist it and wind your twisted trail round it. Heat it, and you might marver it a bit to keep that cylinder neat. And here is a 6th century one, and that's how it's made. Right, moving on, the second bit of exotic imports. Most of the exotic imports, I think, were made in furnaces. So here we are. These are thread decorated beads that seem to have come from Syria. But they are, you see how they're quite crude. They've got blobs everywhere, really. So it's quite likely they were not made with stringers. They were made in using a furnace to heat up the glass, working in and out of a glory hole. These are drawn beads. To make drawn beads, you would, again, want a big gather of glass, which is very hard to produce over a small heat source. And these are called reticella beads, which is a slight misnomer, but these are actually twisted cables. They've come to be called reticella, which is not quite the right term in glassmaking. And these required much thicker cables than the little thin cables I showed you that I've been making. So they would probably have wanted a furnace too. Now, the ones that have really caught my delight were the Mosaic millefiori beads. Now, I have to use both terms because people shy away from using the term millefiori because they say it means flowers. but in the glassmaking world, millefiori just means like a stick of rock. You bunch lots of colours of glass together, and then you pull them out, and you can take slices, a bit like the famous paperweights, which are called millefiori. Now, these are almost certainly made in furnaces and probably mass produced, and the ones that are turning up in Britain, there's not a huge number of them, but if you think each one of these has to be pre-made, these patterns running through the glass, it's a fascinating subject. And that's my photograph from Leiden Museum. They've got a lot of these mosaic millefiori beads, and that's from Icklington in Suffolk, and they're almost identical. You've got the same canes cropping up. So in these beads, you've not only got the bead shape and the bead colour and the decoration, but you can actually start identifying the different canes cropping up in different places. They're quite skilled. I've been making them. They are the hardest of all. The amount of disasters I've had trying to make these have been high, but I'm getting better. Hadley Road in Ipswich compared to the Northern Black Sea. This is Alexander. There is the same pattern popping up in the same bead. And this is Townsend Farm in Kent, and this is from Israel Museum. Again, we've got the same type, slightly different colorways, but the same type of bead. So I've been looking at where they're found in Britain and in the Western world. This is again work in progress, because sometimes mosaic beads, it's a very general term used in reports. It's really difficult to be sure until I actually track the bead down, or I see a drawing or a photograph, to be sure that it is a millefiori mosaic bead. Again, some of these terms being too general, we could do with getting much more definite, precise descriptions. They turn up in graves from the late 6th to the 7th century, so a bit later. They often turn up when the amethysts start appearing, and they're usually only found in small groups or singly, and in a very limited number of designs. And I've started building up my map of Europe. I haven't actually checked out the Greek and Turkish areas yet. I'm fascinated to see if I can get hold of some reports from there. And again, I haven't found any as yet in Spain. These aren't indicating single beads. This is just where I've found reports. But there certainly seems to be a concentration of them, particularly around in this part of the Near East here. But this does only show the red-capped mosaic bead spread. So here are some examples of the ones that I've been making. How were they made? I have tried every which way to see if I could find out. And I made assumptions, and the assumptions were wrong, and I had to go back to the drawing board. So they could be made in two ways. You make your millefiori cane first, and I'm going to show you an example of that being a slide showing that. You then cut the cane into slices. You can make the beads in two ways. Round beads, you can actually use tweezers to pick up these little tiny pieces of cane and put them onto a base bead, or just stick them to the mandrel. Or you can do a rolled mat. You can fuse beads together. Fuse the canes together. And I'll show you what I mean. Here's making a millefiori cane. You would need a furnace to make them in any quantity. So you get a gob of glass, it's called a gob of glass, and you push hollows into it. You fill the hollows with molten of a different contrast colour, and you build up, alternating blue and yellow, until you've made that sort of shape. You then, here's a sort of cross section as we're building it up. So you're looking at the end of it. You then get a glass rod or a pontil with a blob of glass at the end, and you stick it on. You then pull, and pulling it makes it reduce in diameter, and you end up with many, many potential slices. When I've done them, they've been about sort of 5 centimeters diameter, and I end up with little tiny ones. These are all about half a centimeter across. But if you were making it with people to help you, using big lumps of glass and having somebody else to run away from you with pulling the glass apart, you could make much, much more production with many, many more slices. So here they are. These are the ones I have made. You see, they're a bit wonky because I've only got a tiny heat source. So these are the cane types I have identified so far found in Britain. These are the slices from the canes that they were using to decorate. So that one is that one there. This is from Hadley Road in Ipswich. This is Icklingham, and there's that one. That's a composite one, where they started off with that, and then they pulled that thinner and put the smaller ones round. So making the beads, this is the application method, which is what I was determined was going to be the right one for all of them, but is probably most certainly not. You put a little dabs of clear glass inside, which you would never then be able to see afterwards. You pick up your slices. You can cut them, I should have said you cut them up. You can cut them up by using a hammer and hardy, which is the way they cut up the tessera, which is a chisel and a hammer. And it's a bit like a little guillotine that you make. The chisel is held in wood, and you go bang, 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 holding, going along like that. So that's how you cut them. And here, I'm applying my slices to the little globs of molten glass. There they are, all applied in the photograph, and here being melted, and there is the finished bead, which has put itself into a globe. Now this is the way that almost certainly they would have made them mass produced. So it's called rolled mat making by bead collectors, who have been another very useful source of information for me. And here we are. I've set them up to put them into my little kiln. I've laid 2 rods there, and I've put my separate slices like that. Here it is fused together. I bring it up to temperature of about 800 centigrade, and they just about fuse together, not too far, just enough to hold. And then here's a drawing to show it, because it's very hard to take a photograph doing it because I need 2 hands. And you would roll your mat round your mandrel in one go. And here, rolling it on a marvet and neaten it up, and there's a finished bead. And I'm certain that's how they did it, because you can find in the beads, you can find a join in one place all the way along, indicating a rolled mat. So this is the Dover Buckland necklace. I drew a lot of the finds from Dover Buckland many moons ago, and this is a painting of what the necklace would have looked like. Amethyst. This is conjectural because we don't have a very good grade plan, but they had, and that is a decorated, purely decorated polychrome bead. But here we are. We have these 2 beautiful millefiores there, and some plain turquoise. What colour scheme that is, isn't it fabulous? And here's a little group of my replica beads. And so, the conclusions. Unstudied material. Bead collections in this country contain much material. I've been finding annular twist beads, which are some of the most beautiful ones that haven't yet been actually noted. They are lurking in museums. There's a lot to find. The existing classifications are often at fault because of lack of understanding of these techniques. These techniques, they're fascinating. They're easy enough for people who don't actually do hot glass bead making to understand. So it's good to get archaeologists who are working with beads to understand how they are made. Individual bead makers can be identified from beads. Itinerant Anglo-Saxon bead makers, I have made a fairly good case that it seems to be local people working with small furnaces using lampworking techniques, lampworking as opposed to using big furnaces. Exotic imports, there you can start looking even deeper for trade routes, you know, if you've got these beads coming in. Social aspects, potential to study colour choices, fashion changes, family connections, heirlooms. And again, engaging with the public, reconstructions of such beautiful material really has much to offer. So thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sue, for that presentation. I am, as you know, somebody who spent an awfully lot of time looking at many tens of thousands of Anglo-Saxon glass beads, and it's wonderful to be in a position to learn a great deal more about. I mean, well, in fact, some of the terminology, I knew the terminology, but I didn't actually know really what it meant in practice. So it's been very, very helpful indeed to to have that all demonstrated so very, very clearly. Can I ask first of all if we have questions within the room to put to Sue? In which case I'm going to start. Oh yes, we have already. Steve. Yes.
To me, the positioning of the beads on the necklace is so obviously important. Is it the case that it wasn't recorded just in antiquarian excavations, or are archaeologists still not recording the relative position?
It seems to vary a lot between excavations, and I don't know whether that's the conditions or whether the actual excavators are not aware of the importance of it's very hard to tell. But certainly Snape was an absolutely wonderful example of extreme care. And that's fabulous because I've got several necklaces I can reconstruct. Whereas some, even quite recent ones, there was no hope. There just wasn't enough detail. So yes, I don't know the answer to that. I just hope we can encourage all excavations to get a lot more careful, maybe, or maybe the conditions are bad, and if things roll around a lot as the body decays and so on, then it's often the condition. It could well be the conditions.
I'm pleased to actually let you know that the forthcoming report on RAF Lake and Heath, there is a long specialist report precisely on the bead strings. There's
yes.
also a very, very long bit which looks at the beads individually and analytically in the way these are.
I know, that's
And both of these have been done by Peter Brookman,
yes.
in fact, which is very good indeed. I was particularly struck by two of the reconstruction drawings, I think, or paintings that you had done of bead strings, Holywell Row 58, and then it came back again in Dover Buckland towards the end, where you had the string with a little knot in between the beads. Has that ever actually been found, or is it your interpretation of what ought to have been done?
Because it's a very natural thing to do. Right. Because if you string your beads, they will, and they're just on a festoon, they will slide back and forth. And if you knot between, they will hold each bead. Also, if your string breaks and you haven't knotted between, your beads will just be everywhere, and they'll end up under a sunken footed building, so you'll never find them. So I don't believe they were, they were that uneducated in these things. If they love beads, they're very likely to have knotted between. I also do think that it's very likely we had leather being used to stringing, because the leather just decays, and wool is so weak. Linen is better. I've done lots of experiments on this, but I think leather is very, very likely because heavy glass beads, and they're big, would have used it.
I do know we have a little bit of evidence of that from stringing within the beads from RAF Lake. I'm ashamed to say I can't remember what it is, but you email me and I'll be very happy to pass it on. That was done by Sue Harrington of UCL. Managed to identify that. Rebecca, yes.
We have 4 questions from online.
Wonderful.
I'll begin with this one. Was glass made locally or was it imported?
I think the glass was almost certainly made overseas, imported. We were discussing this earlier. You need massive furnaces to make glass, and there are huge tank furnaces have been found in the Middle East and Israel and so on, and you have to get such high temperatures to make the glass, to actually melt sand in effect, using fluxes. So no, and there's no indication that there has been of any. They would leave evidence to these huge furnaces, and most likely. But yes, glass working certainly, and possibly colouring glass too, because I can do that over my little flame with the soles. So.
The next one is: have you found any of the tiny green beads thought to come from India in the Merovingian graves?
Oh, Merovingian.
Thank you.
I haven't studied Merovingian graves particularly. I have been concentrating on Britain and Merovingian is my understanding is that that is in France and the Netherlands and so on, that area. So I really have been, I mean, there are so many beads in Britain, that's enough to keep me occupied for 2 lifetimes, so I'm having to control myself. But yes, I thinking of the little bead, no, I can't really answer that question, I'm sorry. Yeah.
This one is whether you know anything about animals wearing beads, with some anthropological evidence suggesting that animals were also wearing beads, and if you would know anything about that in the early medieval period too. I know that's a little niche, so
That is a really interesting little question, but I'm afraid not. I mean, I haven't come across any. All the graves that I've examined have been human graves. So I haven't, I mean, if they had been burying animals with any beads, I would have imagined I would have come across them, but no, so I haven't come across that.
I've had a couple more in since I was talking, so sorry.
Yes.
How much of a luxury were these glass beads, and what kind of people do you think would be wearing them?
Well, yes, I mean, to me, these are the costume jewellery of the early medieval times. And I think, I mean, it seems to vary a lot between the different cemeteries, but some cemeteries you've got, it seems to be only women's graves, and occasionally a sword bead in a male grave. But some cemeteries, it'll be, say, 50% of the women will have beads in there. Sometimes you'll get a small cemetery and everybody's got beads, you know, and so on. It does seem to be hugely varied. Maybe John has got something to comment about.
Well, I mean, I would largely to agree, though there are some interesting sort of supplementary observations, so that for instance, there is some variation that relatively young adult women often have more glass beads than what in the Anglo-Saxon period counts as old women, which is, you know, would be sort of late 30s onwards, I'm ashamed to say, from them. But life expectancy were very low, and there is a fall off as you get later on in life. And there's also interesting observations that when you get women are dressed with very, very large festoons of beads, almost inevitably there will be more of a variety within a large number of beads than there are with, you know, when we're talking about 100 beads rather than 20 beads, there will also be maybe 15 different types as opposed to 2 or 3 different types. And it is not unlikely within those 15 different types that you'll have 1 or 2 specimens of what look like very old and obsolete beads, you know, beads that have, if you put it in is a much more narrative way of putting it, say this was grandmother's bead which has somehow survived and been handed down. It's survived 2 or 3 generations, but for the most part people seem to be wearing stuff that is quite up to date for their own generation at least. So, yeah, do you agree with that?
Well, I do, yes, but also I do have this theory that older women, when they die, they leave their beads to their younger relations.
Could be.
And that might be why they don't. Whereas a young woman who hasn't yet produced any children will be buried with her beads. That's just a thought.
Yes.
Possibly be. There's a wonderful grave. In fact, I drew it from Portway East of a 12-year-old with a fabulous necklace with a lot of the feathered beads. They call them wild beads, don't they? And she was only 12 years old, and the poor little thing, it would have reached her knees, I think. But maybe, you know, her mother had died and she was the last remaining. It's possible, isn't it? And of course, you get babies' graves where they're buried with just a few little tiny beads, which is
just one round the neck.
Just round the neck, yes.
Speaking of one bead,
Right.
is it possible to determine whether individual beads not found in context are ancient or replicas?
Well, I think I would be fairly good at telling now, because I mean, as I said, I'm seeing signatures in these beads, and so the types, I'm dividing them into these types, like the twisted cables. I mean, I think mine look awfully like them because I'm not a terribly great bead maker, I feel. So they, but there is also the factor of the decay, and I have never yet seen a bead out of a grave that looks like a bead, like a replica bead I've made. So I think that, you know, anything that has been under the ground, unless you'd actually, like this can happen in the Middle East, they make these little pottery lamps and they bury them and then they pull them out and sell them to the tourists, you know, as Roman. But unless somebody was actually artfully trying to deteriorate the bead and the glass, because glass does last pretty well.
Yeah, of course you may. Yes, yes. It's lovely. Very good.
So, from your research so far, have you noticed any routes that iterate bead makers might have taken across southern and eastern England?
Well, this is fascinating because I'd love to now start plotting it. I mean, I haven't yet, but I absolutely agree. What a great question. Because yes, I'm beginning to see where this, you know, these twisted cables just keep popping up. There's some Prof Lane in Cambridge. I've just been fortunate enough to be allowed to see those beads, and there are loads of these twisted cables, and I'm sort of going, oh yes, another one, yes, yes. So yes, you know, I think this is, and when the beads are rarer too, I mean, these twisted cables are just almost turning up everywhere now, but like the beautiful dark blue beads with little spots on, there are not many of those about, but they're bicone, so you know, shaped like that. And I'm getting very interested in going on the trail of these and seeing where they. But the trouble is, they could have been the people who bought them could have travelled, couldn't they? They could have gone to some market somewhere and gone back. So we've never been quite sure.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much. Clearly, that this has quite rightly been but been a subject which has attracted a very, very great deal of interest and highlighting. There's an awful lot of this material, and it's crucially important for us to be able to understand this particular period, and indeed, not least, as you say, because in gendered terms, it is so much a feature of women and how women were presented and represented within this particular society. So it is a matter of enormous interest, and we're hugely grateful to you for coming along and giving us this talk this evening. I will close the proceedings by giving notice that the next meeting of the Society will be on Thursday, the 31st of March 2022 at 5 p.m, when we shall hear a paper, A Life in Ruins, a stonemason study of southern Britain's ancient monuments, churches and bridges, by Andrew Ziminski, FSA. The meeting stands adjourned.